Hello, my name is Ashley Jeffords, and this is my research presentation entitled The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Maya Lin and the Reinvention of the War Memorial. I chose this topic because it has a close association with my heart. My mother is a veteran of the war in Iraq, and in high school I had the honor of participating in my school's honor drive, where we bused veterans to DC for a fancy lunch and typically a tour of memorials, or we'd go to Arlington. One year we visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial with actual Vietnam vets. It was a very impactful and powerful moment in my life that I'll never forget, and I'm forever more grateful for the experience. First off, I would like to offer some context into the reason the memorial even needed to be built: the Vietnam War. This war began within Vietnam in the power scramble that occurred after 1945. American involvement came in 1954 when our troops and military, as well as our political systems, backed South Vietnam against Ho Chi Minh and the communist government he instilled in North Vietnam. The war ended in 1975 when the final American troops fled Saigon as it fell to Northern forces. At the conclusion of the war, 3 million people died. 2 million of those were Vietnamese citizens, whether they were soldiers or civilians, as many were. This also included 58,000 American troops. Our involvement with Vietnam in the first place, and the forced withdrawal with no success, was very controversial in American society at the time, especially considering the fact that many of those fighting were conscripted into service and didn't necessarily back what we were there to do anyhow. I chose these two photographs that I found on the National Archives website that was taken by Army photographers, because I think they capture a lot of the essence of what was going on at that time. On the left, we have the photograph of Private Fred L. Greenleaf crossing a deep irrigation canal during Operation Bang Dong. You can see he looks scared. His face is smudged up. He's chest deep in water, full equipment, huge gun that he's trying to prevent from getting waterlogged. You can see his platoon members behind him. Just one long trail. You can see that they have a Vietnamese person along with them. They might be their interpreter or maybe a guide, but it shows you what the men were going through day by day on the ground. This was every day. On the right, we have a photograph of a Vietnamese mother feeding her young child with rations given to her by U.S. soldiers. I can see this photo in a few ways. It definitely lends to the narrative that the American soldiers were there to hurt more than to help. But it also shows the reality of a life where your resources are depleted to a point where you have to depend on a foreign power to provide you with food. Now that we've established the context of the conflict, I want to quickly touch on the history of sculptural memorialization practices up to the end of the Vietnam War. A quick aside, I did spend my undergraduate career studying at Gettysburg College, the site of the historic battle, and another reason why I'm so interested in monuments, especially war memorials, are the hours I spent walking the battlefields and contemplating many of the ones that are controversially still there today. Pictured here are 2 Confederate war memorials that are currently still standing in Gettysburg, and were created in the tradition of hypermasculinity and heroism that dominated sculptural memorials found pre-Vietnam Veterans Memorial. you can see the picture on the left is President Harry Truman. He actually has a deep connection with Gettysburg and the college itself. But you can see him in front of the Virginia Monument. Now, Virginia was a Confederate state during the war. Here you can see General Lee prominently, proudly leading his men to a non-victory, but still he looks heroic, brave. You can see at the front, there's this sort of pedimental sculptural relief where it's the melee of battle, but it's the hyper-masculine, heroic white male that you would expect to see. On the right is the Louisiana State Memorial in Peace and Memory, which wasn't even installed onto the grounds of Gettysburg until 1971. You can see on the lintel, I guess I'll call it, is a dead soldier wrapped in a Confederate flag. It's hard to tell in this picture, but you can, when you're close and in detail, you can see how masculine, how muscly, and how saintly he looks lying there. Here you have victory, and that's like the trumpet of victory leading him or watching over him, yet we all recognize this as a moment of non-victory in that time. In their article, The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Commemorating a Difficult Past, Robin Wagner Pacifici and Barry Schwartz explain this tradition by writing, "In the case of war memorials, traditional expectations are satisfied by a variety of forms, including memorial buildings, realistic statues of fighting men, obelisks, arches, granite monoliths, and other structures that prominently name the war being commemorated and combine particular physical elements, including vertical preeminences, grandness of size, and lightness of color, with national symbolism." Now that we understand how deep-rooted in masculinity and phallic objects this sculptural tradition is, it'll become more obvious how what Maya Lin does create does not meet any of those standards set. Pictured here is Maya Lin herself. She was born in 1959 in Athens, Ohio, to Chinese immigrant academics who had fled communist China. She was a 20-year-old Yale student studying architecture and sculpture when she entered a contest that would forevermore alter the landscape of sculptural memorials. This contest was the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund Design Competition that began accepting design submissions in 1979. Pictured below is the site analysis that they would have given out as a reference as to what they were expecting. This fund was backed by the American Institute of Architects and the National Endowment for the Arts. 1,421 entries were submitted, and in 1980, a panel of 8 well-respected artists, sculptors, architects, and other higher-ups in the art world chose the anonymous design that ended up belonging to Maya Lin. On the left, you'll see Maya Lin's design submission, and on the right is Lin herself with a diorama of her winning design. Daniel Abramson, in his article Maya Lin in the 1960s, Monuments, Timelines, and Minimalism, describes the judging panel as being comprised of mainstream modernists. Abramson also effortlessly compiles all the formal elements of her design, writing, "An identical pair of black granite walls, descending into the grassy earth, in the northwest part of the mall and meeting at an angle so as to point equally to the nearby Lincoln Memorial and Washington Monument. The wall surface is a complete listing of the war's 58,156 American dead, arranged chronologically, beginning and ending with the dates 1959 and 1975 at the memorial's vertex. Personally, I love the memorial. It is minimalist, calm, and maintains a huge presence in the vista and among the mall of monuments. Descending to the vertex is a humbling experience. Every name you walk past is someone who never came home. I think it somberly celebrates a war with no winners, but indicates the reverence for those brave enough to answer the call to fight. The design received... I also want to mention that it was dedicated on November 11th, Veterans Day in 1982. Identity politics created immediate pushback. There were public cries from influential veterans and politicians such as Ross Perot, who harked at the lack of a heroic figural representation they expected out of a memorial of such magnitude. That group of people, backed by Ross Perot, actually funded the creation of another Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This one is figural, of 3 men, soldiers, battle-ready, super masculine, and just staring out into the darkness. But identity politics quickly came into play as Lynn's identity became public. Many were enraged that a 21-year-old woman from Chinese immigrant parents was even an acceptable candidate. What did she know about patriotism or the realities of war? This led to somewhat of a theoretical breakdown in the art world and the public as to what truly does a war memorial look like. A big question that they were asking, and that has guided my research, is what defines a public memorial and who has the right to create them? Looking at further examples of memorials that were controversial, I looked at Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which was installed in Federal Plaza in New York City from 1981 to 1989. It's very similar, actually, to Maya Lin's design. It's minimal, abstract, and it was also chosen by a jury of peers who were funded, and it was also a site-specific work. Hilda Hine notes in What is Public Art? Time, Place, and Meaning that he meant to confront the public in the behavioral space, and that is what truly made this work so controversial. People were interrupted through their daily routines. Surrounding the plaza is a lot of bank buildings and federal buildings that had a high capacity of employees, and this 120-foot steel arc that essentially bisected the plaza made them have to physically react and change their whole direction. It was no longer the easy walk to lunch, and that's what eventually led to it being taken down. A more recent subversion of the traditional stereotype of what a memorial sculpture should look like is Kehinde Wiley's Rumors of War, which came out in 2019. I had the luxury of seeing it when it was on display in Times Square in New York City, but its permanent home is in Virginia, and it directly confronts the Confederate war memorials that line the main avenue there. You can see that this is meant to be a reclamation of the Confederate War Memorial. He's not the figure you would expect to see seated on a horse. He's not white, he's not old, he's not a general from the Civil War. He is a contemporary black man. He has braids in his hair, a hoodie on, and he's wearing Nikes. He's not proud and boastful upon this horse, but he makes his presence feel known. You can tell that he's directly confronting the horrible past and tradition that lies within Confederate memorials. In conclusion,